Donald Trump says Hollywood is dying fast. The US president blames foreign countries for the crisis, and he's ordered a 100% tariff on imported films and those produced outside the United States. But how will the tariffs work, and what will be their larger impact? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. In recent years, California, home to America's film industry, has slipped to become the 6th most preferred location to shoot and produce movies. Hollywood producers are moving to cities in Canada, the UK, Central Europe and New Zealand, lured by a range of financial benefits on offer. Donald Trump wants to reverse this trend and says he wants to make movies in America again. And he's using the stick to do so. Trump has ordered 100% tariffs on imported movies and those made outside the US. The move has confused Hollywood and the European film industry. So how will the tariffs be implemented? Will a movie partly produced outside the US be punished? And what about films made for streaming platforms? And how will the tariffs affect the movie industry globally? I'll get to those questions and put them to our panel in a moment. But first, Alex Baird sets the stage with this report.
The glitz and the glamour of Hollywood. But scratch beneath the surface, and this is the centre of a film industry in crisis. Donald Trump's solution: tariffs. The president announced his plans to impose a 100% tax on all films produced outside the United States. He says the industry is dying a very fast death.
A lot of it's been taken to other countries, and a big proportion. And I'm actually going to meet with some because, there's some advantages, I guess, and I'm not looking to hurt the industry. I want to help the industry. But they're given financing by other countries. They're given a lot of things. And the industry was decimated. If you look at how little is done in this country now, you think we were the ones. We used to do 100, not long ago, 100%. Now we do almost like very little. It's shocking.
Hollywood has been struggling to get back on its feet after dealing with a series of mass industry strikes and the coronavirus pandemic. By 2024, the number of filming days in Los Angeles hit a record low.
The whole movie industry at the moment is in a crisis already. We had COVID, which had a huge impact on movie going. We had dual strikes in the United States, which shut down production for a long period of time. Hollywood and the film industry is really struggling to recover from those major impacts. If we add on top of that extra costs of production or these tariffs, it could really have disastrous effect on the industry.
Many films are now shot or produced in a growing number of countries which offer tax incentives and lower labour costs, such as the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. A recent survey of Hollywood studio executives revealed their top 5 preferred production locations were all outside the United States. The industry has reacted cautiously to Trump's plans, saying they support the overall goal of increasing production in the US. But there are concerns about how the tariffs would be implemented. Many elements of film production are now completed around the world, but they are then assembled through post-production in the United States.
I think the most likely consequence is not that more productions will be done outside of America or more productions will be done in America, but probably that just fewer productions will be made.
There are also fears about how the rest of the world will react. Hollywood brings in most of its box office revenue from overseas, with around 70% coming from outside North America. Any reciprocal tariffs could prove fatal to an industry which is already at breaking point. Alex Baird, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss all this further with our panel of guests today. And in Los Angeles, we have Jonathan Handel, an entertainment lawyer and journalist. In London, Chris Southworth, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce, United Kingdom. And also in LA, Kamran Pasha, Hollywood director, screenwriter and a novelist. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Well, as is often the case with Donald Trump, he's focusing on an issue where there is real grievance and economic pain. The question we're going to have to ask in this programme is whether he's properly diagnosed the causes and whether his remedy is actually going to solve the problem or make it much worse. But let me start with you, Jonathan. There is a really very real issue here, isn't there? One figure I saw, film and television production in LA has fallen by nearly 40% over the last decade.
It has collapsed. Thank you. It's good to be. The production in Los Angeles has collapsed. Los Angeles, in fact, is doing worse than other locations within the United States, let alone the international locations that Alex pointed out in his piece. And that's because of tax incentives offered by other states, such as Georgia in particular. The way the tax incentives work, that's kind of a confusing term, is that the producer essentially gets a rebate on the production costs that are spent, say, within the state of Georgia, if they're shooting in Atlanta. And that rebate subsidizes production. It can be as high as 40%, 40%, almost half the cost of what's expended in that state. It's been very difficult for the reasons that Alex pointed out and that Scott Roxborough, former colleague of mine, pointed out, namely COVID, the strikes, and also the so-called streaming wars. The companies spent a lot to try to catch up with Netflix, the traditional companies did. And then they found that the stock market was suddenly punishing them for that because of the losses, the financial losses they were taking. And so there's been an enormous cutback in content spending.
Kamran, you're also in LA. Let me ask you your take on what's gone wrong. You heard some of the things there from Jonathan, impact of COVID, high costs, strikes. Some are even mentioning the recent wildfires. And of course, there's also on the horizon the advent of AI as well.
Well, thank you for having me on. Yeah, I'm going to speak from the perspective really of someone, on the production side. And I've worked as a screenwriter and director. I've worked a lot in television in particular, and I've worked on several television shows that have filmed partially. Often it's all of our filming, and that's the post-production is done somewhere else. But overseas, I'll give you an example. CW Nikita, the spy show that was filming in Canada. My very first TV job was on the Twilight Zone remake with Forrest Whitaker. That was our writers' room was in Los Angeles, where I was based, but our production was in Vancouver. And so that's very common. And again, as our colleague here has pointed out, it's all because of money. Hollywood just comes down to money. It comes down to to how they can balance their books. And when you look at the incentives overseas, it's often just a lot easier. And to add on to that, because we've now had many decades of overseas filming, they have very talented crews. You can get incredible crews in Australia. You can get incredible crews now in Eastern Europe. A lot of horror movies are being made there, for cheap in Eastern Europe, and because they now have very established crews. And now you have crews as well in the Middle East, in the Gulf states in particular, developing interesting crews. So this has been a long-term process here. It is a problem. I would love to be able to just go to set here in Los Angeles from the writer's room of a show I'm working on. The reality is that the economics are not making it easy. But I personally, maybe it's just my philosophical belief, I'm a bit of a libertarian, is I don't think tariffs in general achieve their objectives. And in this case, I think it's going to be disastrous because the film industry is one of the few industries left where we're still exporting. This is still a dominant cultural phenomenon. The United States is spreading its film material, television throughout the world, and is very different from many other industries where manufacturing and other processes are now literally overseas, and we have these deficits. We're actually trading here. People want to see American movies and American television shows. If you make them more expensive, it's not going to help us in continuing to grow in that way. And so it's very problematic from my point of view.
Chris, let's talk about where the business has gone. And clearly, we heard about Central Europe and the growing business there. But a lot of this business, not surprisingly, as we're talking about English-speaking movies, has gone to English-speaking countries, to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and, of course, where you are, the UK. But let me put this to you. I saw a recent report that one recent film, 2022's Jurassic World Dominion, that Universal Studios, which produced that film, received £89 million, that's $118 million from the US government to film there. Is that unfair? Is Trump onto something?
Well, we're talking about a global industry that's highly competitive, as the previous speakers have referred to. But, let's be clear here in terms of tariffs are bad for business and bad for consumers in whatever shape or form. We've been talking a lot about the wider trade environment. Now we're talking particularly about the film industry. But, ultimately the losers here will definitely be on the US side. This is an import tax, effectively for US consumers and businesses alike. It affects everybody else, of course, but the rest of industry will carry on in what they're doing. Nobody's trying to undermine the US here. I mean, if you look at the UK, obviously there's a lot of work going on in the UK, but it's very complementary to the US. It's at times very difficult to know whose film it is in many ways, who the studio is, where the locations are, where the talent pools are. But, there's a huge center of expertise here, which is leveraged a lot by US companies. And I think there's a very deep working relationship. But there is a rebalancing going on within that global industry overall. And I think the answer to this is to work together. Nobody wants to see Hollywood suffer, I don't think, here. But it is about working together, not working against each other.
Jonathan, it's probably worth reminding viewers that the film industry has been dominated by the US over the last 100 years and still is dominated by the US. If you look at the big five Hollywood studios, they're all American. Sony Pictures, yes, has a Japanese parent company. You look at the streaming companies like Amazon, Netflix, Apple, they're all US. This isn't a case where Donald Trump says, foreign companies are ripping us off. These are all US companies at the end of the day, are they not?
Well, that's absolutely right. And there's sort of a tension between, on the one hand, working in a complementary way, as Chris points out, and working globally. Some films, for example, are shot in different countries for creative reasons as well as economic reasons. The Mission Impossible film that's coming out shortly, the James Bond films, obviously, which are now owned by Amazon, variety of films like that. Others are shot purely for economic reasons, might even be set in Los Angeles, but shot in Canada, shot in the UK. And it is a U.S. export industry. I agree with both of my colleagues here that tariffs are absolutely not the answer. They are not feasible. It's not clear what you would tariff, how you would value a tariff. They will create retaliatory tariffs that will harm the U.S. enormously, and they will not decrease the cost of production, which is really what's necessary. As you point out, when one film gets 89 million pounds from the UK government, that is an attractant as opposed to a tariff being a barrier. And the U.S. needs to up its game in terms of attracting production back to the United States.
Kamran, let's just go back a little bit to the beginning of the year. And just before Trump's inauguration, he was going on about this issue, what's going on in Hollywood. And he said he was going to entrust it to 3 special ambassadors. And then he named 3 big-name actors, Jon Voight, Sylvester Stallone and Mel Gibson, as his special ambassadors. One of those figures, Jon Voight, was at Mar-a-Lago just before Trump tweeted about his new plans. These are people who top the billing in their time in movies, but what do they know about the business of Hollywood?
Well, I think, first of all, they're all talented people. And I do think it's fair to say that they're intelligent people who understand the business. I think Mr. Gibson proved himself with The Passion of the Christ. He ended up making $1 billion movie that Hollywood didn't believe was going to be successful, and he kept those profits. So these are smart people. Mr. Sylvester Stallone has very well understood the market that he's in for decades. So these are very intelligent people. I think it's fair to say that. I think they understand the industry's economics a lot better than President Trump does. And so I think amongst their conversation, I'd be interested to see what they're saying to the president, because they understand the very things that our panel here is talking about, and they know the economics, especially Mr. Stallone, who I believe has filmed a lot of his projects overseas in Eastern Europe and other places, so he understands the incentives involved. The fundamental thing that I hope that they're saying to the president is the issue of costs is not something that I think tariffs are going to resolve. It's going to increase them, and here from the point of view of the we went through a writer's strike. I'm a member of the Writers Guild, and I was very critical of some of the choices made by our guild leadership. I was very publicly critical and privately to them critical. The end result has been after that strike, we've lost 40% of jobs amongst writers. 40% in just 1 year. Can you imagine a 40% unemployment rate in other industries? And so it's coming down to the costs that are coming from the union structures. That's not something I believe the president, certainly with this proposal, can impact. And that's something that needs to be addressed here on the grassroots level. Adding more cost to it is just going to make fewer productions. People say that, well, why don't these stars and others take bigger pay cuts? Well, human nature is people don't take pay cuts for themselves, and they cut other expenses. That's human nature, and we understand that. And so as a result, they'll just make fewer productions. And that's the reality of things, and no one benefits from that.
Chris, you heard mention there from Kamran of Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. Well, he's making a sequel, The Resurrection of the Christ, and it's filming in September in Italy. Makes the point, doesn't it?
Well, I think producers, I'm not a film expert, but I suspect they pick their locations and pick their places of work for good reasons. But if you just put that into the UK context, I can't speak specifically about Italy, but if you look at it in the UK context, the numbers are, this is a $5.6 billion industry in terms of its value. It contributes 12.6 billion to the UK economy, employs 86,000 people, and it's one of our fastest growing sectors. It's a jewel in the crown of the UK economy. It grew 56% in 2023. So, I think it's worth looking at what those incentive structures are, because the UK film industry has struggled for decades, actually, prior to having more focus put on it. But, if you look at whatever the incentives are being used by the UK, tax incentives are part of that mix. It's slightly dwarfed by the 70 subsidy schemes and tax break schemes in the US as well. The UK could never, ever compete with the US in that sense. It's a fraction of the US industry, but there is an enormous complementarity. And I'm sure that's the case with Italy, Eastern Europe, or Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand, or other countries for that matter, where there are real deep pools of talent, where we like I say, complement each other. We should be working together on this to find the right solutions, particularly for Hollywood, which is a great icon and institution that we all admire and we're huge consumers of.
Jonathan, if we look at what Trump has said and what he put on his Truth Social platform, there are lots and lots of questions. We don't know a lot about Trump's plan, do we? What do you want to know most about how this is going to work?
Well, let me address something first that Cameron said, and then I'll respond to that question. We actually do know a bit about what John Voight said to Donald Trump, because there has been reporting on that. He did give a report to Trump that was leaked to a journalist, I think. And in fact, Voight is not looking primarily for tariffs. Voight is looking for tax incentives for exactly the mechanism that we've been talking about here. And he mentions tariffs in passing as a potential approach. And it seems that Donald Trump latched onto that. He's said in the past that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. And the result is that we do have something, to respond to your question, that raises more questions than it answers. How you would value what's being tariffed, whether television, he mentions movies. Cameron quite rightly has mentioned television repeatedly, because television is a big part of the filmed entertainment business and is suffering just as much, and in some ways is inseparable from film. If you make a film for Netflix, is that a movie or is that a television program? It's both, obviously. So the Trump proposal, again, would it cover TV? Would it cover things that are shot overseas because you have to shoot them creatively overseas. Do you want to see Mission Impossible where the agents just run around the U.S. and don't run around the world to exotic locations? There are real questions here, and I know we'll get to as well. There are real legal questions, not just feasibility questions and open questions, but in fact legal questions as to this proposal.
Cameron, just tell me what the feeling is of you and your colleagues there in LA, because sometimes Trump floats things and they never get mentioned again. And other times, and we've seen it certainly with tariffs, they become something that completely affects the whole global economy. Do people there think he's being serious about this? And the comments came out about the same time as he said he was going to reopen Alcatraz as a prison.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's obviously a widespread dislike for President Trump in the industry, certainly amongst people I know. And so there's just often an emotional reaction to anything he says or does. But I think after we've been watching what's been happening with the tariffs, people are seeing, that he's serious about these things, but they're also seeing that he doesn't seem to know what his plan is. And the plan keeps changing daily, as we're witnessing with these tariffs in other industries. So based on what they're witnessing and based on his ambiguous comments, I think there's a belief that that he's sort of using the madman theory, if you'd like, of politics, of saying extreme things and to achieve his objectives. I'm actually fascinated by President Nixon, who has been the most associated with the madman theory of politics, and I think he was very good at that. I'm not sure President Trump is as successful with that idea, because I do believe that President Nixon would strategize many years in advance to open up China and things like that, and would bluster and create sort of the madman perspective of going one way and then going another way. But that was a long-term plan. I don't believe that the general opinion in Hollywood is that President Trump thinks from the point of view of a long-term plan. He seems to act on an instinct and information that he has, and if the information is inaccurate or incomplete, eventually other forces push him to go in another direction. But this is the kind of chaos I don't think anyone wants. We already had enough chaos, as we pointed out, with how COVID was managed here in productions, and then the strikes, which I think were very close to killing blow to a lot of working people in Hollywood. And I think that adding more chaos will be a shot to the head that I don't think anyone wants.
Jonathan, you're a Californian lawyer. In your view, is this legal, what he's doing?
No, absolutely not. And in fact, by the way, we saw the White House the day, 12 hours after the social media posting, walking the proposal back and saying it's one thing under consideration, whereas the proposal had said that Trump was ordering the Commerce Department and U.S. trade rep to begin the process of instituting tariffs. The reason it's not legal is twofold. One is that the authority that Trump claims for all of the tariffs that he's proposed is the International Emergency Economic Act, Economic Emergency Act. And that act has a specific exemption for films and informational content. That tracks really the First Amendment kinds of issues. It says that the things that are informational, that films specifically, and including but not limited to the following list, cannot be the subject of this kind of action under this authority. And secondly, the World Trade Organization treaties that the United States has long been a signatory to, the World Trade Organization prohibits tariffing electronically transmitted product. So, what happens is films get shot overseas, they get transmitted digitally back to Los Angeles, they might be edited here, probably edited here, ultimately assembled here, and then distributed by the studio or by the streaming company. It's an electronic transmission. It's not legal to tariff that rather.
Chris, let me get your take on that and also add in, are you worried there in London that Trump might try more? I mean, he's talking about movies. What about TV? What about video games? What about music? What about books?
Well, in the current context, anything's possible. It seems to chop and change every 5 minutes. I mean, I think that's one of the big problems here. I'd be particularly concerned around investment. If you look at what's happening in the broader trade environment, there's a lot of rerouting investment or investments being paused or being displaced elsewhere outside the US. And that's simply because the US environment looks uncertain, unpredictable, and there are other locations to take that investment. it's a real concern, and none of us win here, by the way. I think that's also really important. I would also just agree with the previous comment in terms of legally, internationally, there is a global ban on any customs duties or tariffs on digital content crossing borders. And of course, films are a big part of that. And coupled with that, even if the US do contravene that international agreement, which the US is a signatory, there is no clarity on how you would implement it on a practical level because of the complexity of the way films are made in this case. Where is the point of where the cost comes in? How do you know that? Where is it measured? It's not like a physical shipment where you'll catch a tariff or you'll catch a product coming over the border at a port. Digital content moves in all sorts of shapes and forms and through different mediums as well. So it's incredibly complicated in just the practical application, and definitely is enough to ask legal questions around international rules. But I think from an outside country perspective, I think it's for someone like the UK, I think it's just another indication that the US is sort of withdrawing from the international system, not following international rules. What's the message that sends to the rest of the world is not a great one, to be honest. And that's
let me bring in Cameron on this issue of it widening to other digital content, because I know you've worked in TV, in film, in video games. I believe you're also writing 2 historical fiction books. How worried are you personally about the way things are going?
Well, I try not to worry because I don't think you can function as an artist if you're constantly in a state of worry, because there's enough chaos as it is just functioning as an artist, And so I try not to think it from that perspective, because you have to survive as an artist regardless. There's always forces you can't control, and most of those forces are economic, and this would just add another layer to that. So I'm not personally worried, because I'll survive like any artist does. You find a way to do that. What I'm worried about is the effect it's going to have on the beautiful aspect of culture being a human connecting force. I'm very much a believer that culture is meant to be fluid. It is meant to be something where we learn from each other, we influence each other. The fact that anime has become something huge, especially in younger generations. Japanese culture is now, my niece is teaching herself Japanese because she's so obsessed with animes and mangas. That's a way to develop human connection. And I think creating barriers to human connection actually creates conflict. President Trump has often said, he doesn't want to be the war president, right? And I think to his credit, I think to some degree, one can argue that he has perhaps not been as militaristic as other presidents in the past, certainly his first administration. We'll see what he does in his second administration. But I believe that once you create barriers to cultural exchange, to human beings understanding each other, I think that leads to conflict.
Thank you very much, Kamran, and thank you to all our guests today, Jonathan Handel, Chris Southworth and Kamran Pasha. We've talked a bit about streaming in the show. If you missed any of our discussion, you can always see it here again anytime by streaming it on our website, aljazeera.com. If you have comments, post them on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or find us on X. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'll be back here very soon. Until then, from me, James Bays, and all the team, please stay safe and well. Bye-bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.